it's really wonderful to be able to be with you this evening, and lovely to see so many familiar faces and also some new faces. And of course, it's a particular privilege to be able to offer this session in the presence of Jane Rayner, the wife of John Rayner. We'll speak about John, his work, and in particular his liturgical work, but also a general overview. You see here a beautiful picture of John Rayner, and I've chosen this quote by Rabbi Jeffrey Newman, which he shared in his obituary for John. The righteous are called living in their death. It was also kind of the quote that I decided to include at the beginning of my rabbinic thesis, my master's thesis for King's College London, which was on the work of Rabbi John D. Rayner. So this is a topic that is close to my heart ever since rabbinical school. What are we going to try to do today? As I said, we're going to start with a short biographical sketch. It's not going to be a personal biography. It's really going to be more a biography focusing on John's professional life. We're then going to just have a brief overview over John Rayner's work, and it's going to be unbelievably brief, and I will not talk about most aspects of John's work because otherwise we will never finish the session. You can do several days on John Rayner's contribution. And then I will focus on John Rayner's contribution to liturgy, as well as his thinking on the tension between universalism and particularism. Why did I choose these two aspects? Really because what John became most famous for was his liturgy. But I think one of the most interesting contributions he's made to the thinking of progressive Judaism, and it is reflected also in his liturgy, is exploring that tension between universalism and particularism. And I'll say much more on that later. So who was John Desmond Rayner? John was born in Berlin-Schöneberg on the 30th of May 1924 as Hans Sigismund Rahmer. Rayner's father was a staunch but not activist social democrat, he writes himself, who considered himself a Freidenker, a free thinker, and took no interest in Judaism. Before 1933, before the rise of Hitler, Rayner described himself as being barely conscious of being Jewish. But this, of course, changed when Hitler rose to power. Rayner quickly felt the effects of the growing anti-Semitic atmosphere in his school. Consequently, his parents moved him to the Jewish Theodor Herzl Schule, where he was a pupil from 1934 until 1938. There he became friends with Arthur Wolff, in whose parents' home he experienced his first Seder, and with whom he began to attend Shabbat services regularly in a traditional synagogue, where he learned Hebrew, chanting Torah, and celebrated his bar mitzvah. Rayner escaped Nazi Germany on one of the last Kindertransports to England in August of 1939. His sister followed a few weeks later, but his parents would not survive the Holocaust. In England, he attended Durham School and was first hosted by the family of an Anglican clergyman, Reverend William Stannard, and later by the family of Reverend Hugh Wilkinson. Rayner's host families in the school were respectful of his Jewish background and made no attempt to convert him. Rayner claims to have learned much about religion at its best from them, and describes that he wished that there was a liberal version of Judaism that had all the virtues of liberal Christianity without the Christianity. Having begun to formulate such a Judaism in his mind, he discovered in the 1940s that it already existed when he visited the liberal synagogue in Hope Place in Liverpool, where he became a regular attendee. After school, having anglicized his name from Rahmer to Rayner, he joined the infantry in 1943. After completing his military service, Rayner read modern languages, moral science, and Hebrew and Aramaic at Cambridge between 1947 and 1953. Rayner was ordained into the liberal Jewish ministry in June 1953 and took up a post as reverend at South London Liberal Synagogue. In 1957, he was, and I'm sure those of you who are from the Liberal Jewish Synagogue will be pleased to hear this, he says he was called to urgent service at the center of the liberal Jewish movement. He served the Liberal Jewish Synagogue first as assistant to Rabbi Leslie Edgar, then as senior rabbi, and finally as emeritus rabbi after his retirement in 1989. During his years at the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, he spent 2 years at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, where he received private ordination in 1965 and began work on a PhD, which he did not complete. I'm very fond of this little snippet of his biography, as I have an unfinished PhD myself, and I fully understand how sometimes we get involved in much more important things than finishing a PhD, and that is most certainly true for Rabbi John Rayner. He did receive a private ordination in 1965 as well. He served as honorary director of studies of Lea College from 1966 to 69 and was instrumental in restructuring the academic curriculum of the college at the time. He continued to teach Jewish liturgy and codes at the college until just before his final illness. After about 2 years of illness, Rayner died of cancer on the 19th of September 2005 in London. He is survived by his wife Jane, their 3 children, Jeremy, Ben, and Susan, and many grandchildren. So this gives you a little bit of a taste of who he was as a person. So let's look at his contribution as a thinker. It's quite difficult to put into just a catchphrase of who was he? A thinker, a liturgist, a halachicist, a writer of Jewish law. So really his most important contribution is to liturgy, to Jewish liturgy. Between the 1960s and the 1990s, he served as the co-editor of all liberal Jewish prayer books, Siddurim, Machzorim, Haggadah. That is a huge amount of his contribution. But he also published extensively on Jewish ethics and spoke extensively on Jewish ethics. He left behind an incredible archive of works where he literally himself indexed every single one of his lectures, sermons, and articles that he produced. An incredible piece of work, and makes it very easy to do research because you can actually go to his own index and say, I am interested to learn of all the passages where Rabbi John Rayner spoke about universalism. And you just need to go to the index and go universalism, and he will list all of the publications as well. And many of them are now actually available online via the library of Lea College. The major publication of his Jewish ethics is The Principles of Jewish Ethics. He also wrote on halacha, most notably Jewish publication entitled Jewish Religious Law, and another publication, A Guide to Jewish Marriage. He wrote and spoke so extensively on these topics throughout his life. And finally, of course, he was a leading voice of liberal Judaism and what it means to be a liberal Jew. And most noteworthy amongst those publications are the Affirmations of Liberal Judaism, which he authored in the original version. It's been developed a little bit further since then. Many of you will be familiar with them, but really an incredible piece of work reflecting on what does it mean to be a liberal Jew. So let's dive a little bit deeper into a few examples. So in particular, looking a little bit at his contribution to liturgy, And as well as later on exploring a little bit further what John thought about the tension between universalism and particularism. So John's contribution to liturgy, as I said, lay, of course, in the fact that he edited all the prayer books for liberal Judaism between the 1960s and the 1990s. But as Michael Shire, and if I didn't miss it, I think at least some of his family members I saw on this Zoom. Maybe I saw his name on the participant list as well. But as he writes in the obituary for his obituary for John Rayner, the prayer books that were co-edited by John really served as models for all subsequent prayer book revisions in the progressive Jewish world. It cannot be underestimated the impact that John's work had on progressive Jewish liturgy all around the world. For instance, what are some of the aspects of his liturgical contribution? For one, there is the use of common English for translations of the Hebrew. The most obvious here would be the replacement of thou with you, but also other phrases that were often portrayed in a very archaic language in the translations of the prayer book. He really pioneered the use of common English for the translations of Hebrew. In his later prayer books, this is not the case. In his earlier work, he also pioneered the use of gender-neutral God language. He was not immediately convinced that this was a huge need, and it really shows, it's one example that showed really how outstanding John truly was, that he actually had a huge willingness to learn from colleagues, that he listened deeply to his colleagues and took them extremely seriously. And this aspect of the gender-neutral God language is one of these aspects, and not just the gender-neutral God language, but also the use of gender-neutral language as much as possible. And for those of you who want to explore this further, it's really wonderful to look at some of the original manuscripts of John's sermons, where you can see that every so often he has decided to adopt the language of humankind, but mankind still kind of types so quickly of the keyboard. So you will see a written text by John typed up on a typewriter where it says mankind, and then by hand it's crossed out and says humankind. So a really wonderful way of actually being able to trace how challenging it is sometimes even for ourselves when we are convinced ideologically to adapt to something new. But John was never shy of adapting new things. He did not change the Hebrew God language into a gender neutral or feminine God language, but he did famously state that he shall leave this to the next generation of liberal liturgists to do. So he didn't do it himself, but he didn't say this is not what should happen. He just said, it hasn't yet been my task. So what else? We also see the incorporation of newly written English editions, newly written text, in particular for those familiar with Siddur Lev Chadash, the introduction of these beautiful themed readings that include not just biblical passages that correspond to the weekly Torah portion, but also include new texts, either newly written texts or texts well known from literature throughout time, including passages by non-Jews. That was quite an innovation to include texts written by non-Jews in a Jewish prayer book. What else was a huge contribution? John talks about the fact that he made corrective innovations, namely significant alterations to the Hebrew texts drawing upon alternative and new renditions. Now, I think the use of the language of corrective innovations really shows that he didn't simply consider these to be further options to be used or ways of making the liturgy better, but he actually considered it a way of fixing mistakes of the past. For John, it was very clear that if prayers expressed positions that could no longer be defended intellectually or theologically, he should correct them to be aligned with liberal Jewish beliefs. And this was really, really important to John. And the place where we see this in many ways most obviously, although you'd see it in lots of places in a much more subtle way, but we don't have enough time to go into all the details of the liturgy. Where you see it in the most obvious way is, in fact, in the aspect of universalizing Jewish liturgy. One of the things that John considered as important is to reflect on what does it mean to be at home in the countries of exile. Right? What does it mean to be at home in the countries of exile after Enlightenment, after the Jews had gained the rights of citizenship and to be a citizen just like any other person? And of course, this was not a new consideration. In fact, from the early reformers of our liturgy, this was a consideration. And so it's not surprising that one of the first benedictions, one of the first blessings that was edited was the blessing for the ingathering of the exiles in the daily Amidah. Now, just so that in case you don't all remember exactly the version of the blessing of the ingathering of the exiles, I'm giving you three versions. So at the top is what is the standard English translation or in English translation of Siddur Ashkenaz. So the Ashkenazi Siddur in the traditional version. I just decided to take it from Sefaria because of convenience, because I can do copy paste from it. But you will see basically this version in most Orthodox prayer books. And I'll read it to you. The blessing goes, sound a great shofar for our liberty and raise a banner to gather our exiles. Gather us together from the four corners of the earth. Blessed are you, Adonai, gatherer of the dispersed of his people, Israel. So that is the traditional blessing. Now, what does John do with this blessing? John writes himself, the early reformers had a political reason for feeling uncomfortable with this blessing. He says, as Jews wished to integrate themselves in the society of their countries of residence, they did not want to give the impression that their true desire was to return to another land. However, the political reason is not enough for John, who suggests that they also had a theological motive for changing the prayer. And he writes, for they argued, since the God of Israel is the God of the whole world, therefore it must be possible to worship him anywhere on earth. Therefore our dispersion, far from being a divine punishment, is actually a God-given opportunity for us to fulfill our mission. So for John, exile didn't become a punishment, wasn't a punishment. For John, it was an opportunity. And we will see this again in his reflections on the tension between universalism and particularism, the importance of being a Jew in the world, that this, in fact, is a gift that we are given rather than a punishment. Now, John does not just follow the radical suggestion of the earlier reformers who often almost eliminated that blessing from the liturgy, because he also took into account the birth of the state of Israel, which he said, brought with it so many great opportunities for Jewish life and learning. So he doesn't embrace the notion of the early reformers that the mission of the Jews can best be fulfilled by living among, not apart from, the peoples of the earth. Instead, he accepts a partial ingathering, but affirms that a total ingathering of the exiles and a complete withdrawal of the people, of our people, from the rest of mankind — these are the days when John still uses the terminology of mankind — is indeed not desirable. And that in the last analysis, liberal Jews believe that as God is independent of geography, so Judaism is independent of geography. And thus Rayner's version of the benediction takes up the theme of liberation, but applies it universally. So what we see in his version, and the version between Service of the Heart, the earlier prayer book, and Lev Chadash, vary a little, but not greatly in direction. We see sound a great horn to proclaim freedom, right? Not necessarily just our freedom, although in Lev Chadash it becomes again our liberation. Inspire us to strive for the liberation of the oppressed, right? Clear universalization, not just the oppressed Jews, but the oppressed of all people. And let the song of liberty be heard in the four corners of the earth. We praise you, O Lord, Redeemer of the oppressed, or we praise you, O God, Redeemer of the oppressed. So we see here a broadening of the idea of what does it mean to be liberated. And for John, we see very clearly he avoids a negation of life in the diaspora and shifts the prayer's focus to universal freedom. And this is important for him because only when freedom is universally established, he writes, Jews will be able to live securely both in Israel and in the diaspora. So we can see his contributions here in two different theological positions. I believe in a God who's not linked to a specific geographic location, and an affirmation that the present role and ultimate destiny of the Jewish people are to be seen in a universal context. And unlike the early reformers, Rayner no longer feels the need to respond to external pressures, but instead shapes liturgy to be an expression of his theological beliefs. So the next innovation that I want to talk about is what I decided to call a truly unique liturgical change. Why do I call this a truly unique liturgical change? Because most of John Rayner's liturgical changes are unique in phrasing, but not necessarily in content compared to other progressive prayer books. In contrast, at the time of the publication of Siddur Lev Chadash, it was the only progressive prayer book known to me. Maybe I'm just not aware, and somewhere hidden there was one, although in the last 12 years I haven't found an example, which made a change to this insertion rather than just omitting it. So Siddur Lev Chadash was indeed the only prayer book that made the change that I will discuss in just a second. And the only other prayer book that includes this change is, in fact, the World Union edition of Mishkan Tefillah, which was developed for the Southern Hemisphere. And you will see why this was adopted by them. In Siddur Lev Chadash, John talks about the theological stance that it must be possible to worship God anywhere on earth, right? We saw this earlier as well. But he takes that stance one step further and says that must mean we need to look at the passage in the Amidah, in the second blessing of the Amidah, where we normally include an insert which changes according to the season. So if we look at the standard Siddur, we see that in summer we say he causes the dew to descend, and in winter we say causer of the wind to blow, and of the rain to fall. Now, in service of the heart, this insert was simply omitted. This is quite common in many progressive liturgies. Other progressive liturgies just decide to adopt one phrase that will be used all year round if they don't omit it altogether. However, John does something different. He does introduce an insertion that will be read all year round, but he adjusts it. Now, he says, of course, why do we see this change from summer to winter? Because this is based on the seasons of the land of Israel. This he considers to be problematic, as it makes the prayer, and I quote John, bound up too closely with a particular region of the world. Now you can see why it's attractive for Jews in Australia or in the Southern Hemisphere to use a different version because, of course, their seasons are inverted. So in order to avoid the implied link to the land of Israel, Rayner introduces this new expanded version of the phrase, which is to be recited throughout the year. You cause the wind to blow and the rain to fall, the sun to shine, and the dew to descend. And in a wonderful little passage talking about the Siddur, he actually says, if this Siddur shall be known as the Sunshine Siddur, I shall be pleased. Just one of those lovely little ways of how John would talk about liturgy. And oftentimes when I pick up Siddur Lech Chadash, I think of this phrase and think maybe the prayer book will bring us a little bit of sunshine, how much we need that in the UK. Now, the change seems to be relatively small from a liturgical perspective in terms of how much space it takes up. However, from a theological perspective, it has quite far-reaching implications, showing clearly that John believed Judaism not to be a tribal religion, which is wholly relevant only to one people and one territory, but rather that it is, in the fullest sense of the world, a universal religion. It doesn't mean he doesn't acknowledge the connection between the Jews and the land of Israel, but he believes that his stance that God is independent of geography should be emphasized, and he always asserted that the universal emphasis does not negate the special relationship between the Jews and the land of Israel. Although, and I note this in my thesis, there is actually nothing in Rayner's version that highlights this special relationship. So we don't see that special relationship here anymore. Now, the final change that I want to talk about, we see in several places. I just pick out one example, but we can see in other places. And that is a very important notion, in my opinion, something that is really critical for us to reflect on as well in current times, or really at any time, namely that John points out quite rightly that the welfare of the Jews is always interlinked with the welfare, as he puts it, of the Gentiles. And he says, we cannot find peace for the Jews if we do not find peace for the world. I gave you two examples, the healer of the sick and the source of peace, but in the Siddur Ashkenaz version, I seem to have not corrected that and just done a copy paste of the first one. So I'm showing this in two examples. One, of course, the blessing for peace, right? John very elegantly says, actually, all Jews say the version of the blessing for peace, the ending of the blessing for peace, as we praise your God, the source of peace. Normally, we all Jews say that in the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And John says there's no reason why we should, for the rest of the year, just pray for who blesses his people, Israel, with peace. But indeed, peace is something universal. He feels likewise that it's not just peace that is universal, but that it really is truly that the well-being of people is linked to the well-being of Jews. So instead of a specific blessing, healer of the sick of Israel, he universalizes this as well. We praise you, O God, healer of the sick. Now, these are all examples of the universalizing tendencies in John's prayer book. Now, was this all well received? Well, in many ways, the changes that John made became completely commonly accepted by the Jewish world, certainly the progressive Jewish world. So we see this about the welfare of the Jews being linked to the welfare of the Gentiles, also in the addition at the end of the Chadash, not just to the maker of peace for all the people of Israel and for all humanity. In fact, there is an example where even the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of the United Synagogue, certainly not a progressive Jew, used the addition in the Kaddish prayer. So we see that some of the liturgical changes became absolutely common parlance in Jewish liturgy of the 21st century. However, not everyone loved every aspect of it. One of his fiercest critics was the American scholar of liturgy, Petuchowski. And Petuchowski had a very active relationship. They wrote each other numerous letters. And even though Petuchowski applauded Service of the Heart as, and I quote, the best liturgy currently in use among the world's liberal and reform Jews, he criticized the exaggerated and misplaced universalism of this prayer book. Although Petuchowski accepts the rightful place of universalism in the liturgy, he accuses John and Chaim Stern, who co-edits the prayer book, of making practically every single prayer a programmatic statement of universalism, suggesting that this type of overexposure is dangerous, as it will, in the final analysis, no longer ring true. Well, that hasn't quite been true. It's been quite a long time since Service of the Heart. So I think in this case, actually, John and Chaim Stern had their finger on the zeitgeist more correctly than Petuchowski. The most lovely thing about the criticism between Petuchowski and Rayner, and with that, we're going to end our kind of reflections on liturgy, is that he once wrote a wonderfully playful letter after the publication of Service of the Heart. And in that letter, he writes that the excessive universalism was as if every time he told his wife that he loved her, he felt obliged to add, and all other pretty girls as well. The letter ended with all good wishes to you, your family, and all mankind. So certainly the sense of humor was preserved. I think what is really the most remarkable when we reflect on John's liturgy, however, is that he felt completely convinced that it was critical for liturgy to reflect the theological position of a movement. And that is very clear from all of his work. So let's go a little bit more broadly and move away from just looking at liturgy. When we look at the tension between universalism and particularism, John is really clear that he is committed to both particularism and universalism in Judaism, but maintains that particularistic practices are ultimately only of value if they can lead to a betterment of the world for all of humanity. So he is clearly committed to particularism, right? He wouldn't be editing liturgy. He wouldn't be engaging in Jewish prayer so much if he wasn't committed to particularism. However, it always seemed, right, that was the critique of Petrachowski, as if he always tended to the universalism. But he says that is not true. In fact, he says very clearly, if Judaism ceased to be particularistic, it would cease to be Jewish. But he also says if it ceased to be universalistic, it would cease to be monotheistic. So a very interesting tension here. I'm going to look into a little bit more detail on two aspects of this tension, namely the concept of the election of Israel, so the election of the Jew, the chosenness of the Jews, and then what does that mean for the mission of the Jewish people, the mission of Israel. So when we think about the concept of the election of Israel, we see that John embraces a concept of election which rejects any notion of racial superiority and resists explanations as to why Jews might have merited election. He basically says Jews felt themselves to be chosen, and we don't really know why that is the case. So he doesn't really explain why Jews might have merited election, why they might have merited to be chosen. He even acknowledges that God may also have special relationships with other groups. And he therefore suggests that the concept of election might have emerged from the historical experience of the Jews, who observed that they always had a special relationship with God, which they chose to enter into, right? Jews felt themselves historically to be singled out, to be different, and they nonetheless chose to enter into this relationship with God. But he argues ultimately that in order to guarantee the continuance of these special relationships, Jews must choose to accept election by taking on the mission of Israel in the world. So he says, yes, you might feel yourself chosen. You might think you are continuing to be chosen, but that comes with responsibility. So what does he mean by the mission of Israel? What does that look like? Well, for him, the Jewish journey is the journey of humanity, in which we Jews are called upon to play a special navigational role, right? We are the navigators of the journey of humanity. That is a huge responsibility. And he says it is the responsibility of the Jews to inject into the life of humanity a morality of mutual respect, mutual tolerance, and mutual love. And he believes that Jews must inject Judaism's values as a redemptive force into the life of human society. Judaism, taken seriously, engenders the very idealism on which the improvement of the world depends. The mission of the Jews is therefore of messianic importance, as it provides the basis of our hope for the future. What is it about this tension between the universalism and the Judaism, right? Why do I need to still be particularistically Jewish? He says, by steeping ourselves in Jewish tradition, we expose ourselves to a whole network of subtle influences which help us to make the sort of people who have the inclination and the ability to live conscientiously, to act responsively, and to labor for the betterment of society. That is why our aim must always be to deepen our Jewish rootedness and at the same time to broaden our Jewish vision. So for John, the mission of Israel must always be twofold, both to ensure our survival and to fill it with content and purpose, both to deepen our commitment to the Jewish cause and to demonstrate that its purpose is to benefit mankind, both to intensify our Jewish education and to relate it more clearly to our universal mission. In short, both to become more Jewish and to become more cosmopolitan. Universalism and particularism interact with and reinforce one another, as in a chemical compound. I love that image. not a physical mixture. I love that image because I'm a chemist and very much not a physicist. They interact with each other and reinforce one another as in a chemical compound. The more steeped you are in your Judaism, if it is the right kind of Judaism, the more conscious you will be of your obligations to humanity. The better a Jew, the better a human being. And so I want to just finish with a quote by Michael Shire, Rabbi Michael Shire, in his obituary for John, where he wrote, "Our moral anchor has been cast off, but we have inherited from him a legacy of ethical values, adherence to integrity of thought and action, and an intellectual discipline to which we aspire." So thank you very much for your interest in John, and I hope that you either have some questions for me or some comments. I should say that I have a sort of strange relationship with John in that I feel like I know him deeply and intimately, but I actually never met him. He died really before I came to London. So I'm kind of the child of his intellectual work, without and get all my relationship to him really from his intellectual work. So I know there are many of you here, and of course Jane, who knew him so much better. So if you do have things to share, then do feel free to also comment.
So Josie asked what John would have made of Judy Chicago's version of the Aleinu.
I think he would have liked it. I really think he would have liked it. I think there are many things in in that version of the Aleinu that reflect the things that were really important to John, right? There's the universal aspect, there's equality. By the way, he talked a lot about the Aleinu. We didn't look at the Aleinu, but he talked about the fact that actually there are very few places in the traditional Siddur where the non-Jew appears, and the Aleinu is one of them, and it's basically an apocalyptic vision of the non-Jew ceasing to exist. So he was very critical of the Aleinu. I don't think he was really a fan of the Aleinu, but I think he would have liked Judy Chicago's version. Although I think probably he knew Judy Chicago's version. I'm not sure. Somebody might know better if he did actually read. I can't remember now when Judy Chicago wrote her poem. John preached a lot about Israel. I have to admit, it's not my field of expertise, John's writing on Israel. I haven't done extensive research on that, but but he um, but he wrote extensively on Israel. He was one of the most vocal, critical voices of Israeli government policy when he thought they were wrong. He preached a very powerful, so one of the sermons that I'm familiar with is a very powerful sermon following Sabra and Shatila in the Lebanon War. Um, so undoubtedly he would be appalled, like I think most progressives are, or all progressives are, by Trump's suggestion about the future of Gaza. I think he would have spoken out very loudly about many aspects of the Gaza war. He was a passionate advocate for the right of all the oppressed to be freed, including, of course, the Palestinians. Um, so he would have been a very clear voice. It's very interesting that while he was absolutely the unanimous voice of Jewish liturgy, basically, for the liberal movement, when it came to Israel, he was one of the voices, and there were other voices in the movement that strongly disagreed with him. Now, the disagreement was always done in a very respectful manner, but it was certainly not that everyone said John is right just because he's critical of Israel. So he certainly would have had some very strong views, probably some very strong views that not all of his colleagues right now would also be sharing. Somebody asked, I think, about what is private ordination. So private ordination is ordination. Ariel had put it in here. So in this case, the reason why I call it private ordination is that John did not study at a traditional rabbinic program as we know it kind of today, or as Hebrew Union College had already established, like a kind of 5-year degree program. He was at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, but he was in the PhD program, not in the rabbinic ordination program. It used to be very common that many of the ministers in the synagogues, both in the liberal and reform movement, but also in the Orthodox movement, were not ordained in the classic sense, but were reverends. And then sometimes they received ordination. And in John's case, it was decided that his work and his studies merited him being ordained as a rabbi, but because he didn't complete the traditional program at Hebrew Union College, he wasn't ordained by Hebrew Union College. He was ordained by individual rabbis. So that's what's a private ordination.
Please would Rabbi Lea expand on what John Rayner meant by progressive Judaism, which I think you refer to in your informative and beautifully crafted lecture.
So what would he mean by progressive Judaism? I think it's a really, really interesting question. Would he have considered himself a progressive Jew or a liberal Jew? I think he was a very much a liberal Jew as the beginning of the liberal movement, right? He was even though he was German, he was very English. My sisters always joked that about me. I'm German, but I'm so English now. Although my English friends still say I'm terribly German. But there were certain things like he was very precise still. So that was this Germanness, right? You would get letters back from him which corrected every spelling mistake. And God forbid you made a spelling mistake in the Hebrew, you would definitely know about it. So he was a liberal Jew in that sense. I think what it meant for him to be a progressive is really, and that's why I picked out this focus on the universalism versus the particularism. I think for him, what really was critical was Jewish religious practice was unbelievably important to him, but it wasn't important for its own sake. And I think that's what he would say is what it means to be a progressive Jew, to be steeped in your Judaism, not just for its own sake, but in order to bring about a betterment of the world, to make the world fairer, more just, and so on. And if that meant you should change your own practice because your own practice is lacking those aspects, then you should change that practice as well. So I think this is how he would have said, what does it mean to be a progressive Jew? It means being steeped in your tradition, and in your Judaism, but being conscious of your obligation to humanity and really to be a better Jew in order to be a better human being, not just in order to be a better Jew.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Lea. That was absolutely wonderful. And especially, I think, for those of us who are familiar with Siddur Lev Chadash, to really illumine the life and thoughts of one of its editors. It's been really, really fascinating. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, all of you, for being with us again tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Really a pleasure to see you all.